Welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to really get into a stack of disturbing yet profoundly insightful sources you've sent us. We're going to try and distill them into some kind of understanding.
And it's a tough subject. We're exploring the absolute extreme edges of human cruelty.
Exactly. We're focusing on cases where the most foundational relationship you can imagine, kinship, trust, primary care, was just, well, violently and devastating betrayed.
That's right. When you look at the core of true crime, there's really nothing more jarring than when that familial compact fails. And these sources, they force us to examine a very difficult psychological and legal spectrum.
A spectrum? How so?
Well, on one side, you have what we could call calculated malice. It's rooted in sociopathy, narcissism, and this just cold desire for personal convenience or freedom.
And on the other side?
On the other, you see the shattering impact of psychosis, a mind that is completely, utterly detached from shared reality because of a profound mental illness.
And what's so crucial, what these collected materials really highlight, is how often the legal system, and this is across centuries, has struggled, often painfully, to define the difference between those two poles.
It is the difference. It's everything. It determines culpability, right? It's the difference between a prison cell and a psychiatric hospital.
And that struggle is never more pronounced than when the victims are children and the perpetrator is, say, the mother or the primary caretaker.
So today, we're going to unpack these shocking cases. We'll analyze not just the horrific acts themselves, but why the legal and social outcomes really matter for understanding justice, mental health, and institutional protection.
We'll be navigating from cases of chilling premeditation that shocked the modern world,
all the way through to historical horrors that actually influenced our social system. And finally, we'll touch on those huge, sensational cases where investigative failures meant the truth. Well, it remains permanently out of reach.
Let's begin where that calculation is the clearest, with a motive of absolute personal control.
We're starting with cases where the sources just overwhelmingly point toward premeditation, narcissism, and this profound desire for personal freedom.
Where children were viewed not as loved ones, but as, well, inconvenient obstacles to a desired life. And the foundational modern case for this mindset has to be Diane Downs.
It's harrowing. We're on a rural Oregon road, May 1983.
And Diane Downs drives herself and her 3 children to the hospital. The story she gives is that they were victims of a carjacking
by a bushy-haired stranger. But the physical reality was just devastating. Her 7-year-old Cheryl was already dead.
And her other 2, 8-year-old Krista and 3-year-old Danny,
gravely wounded. They've been shot multiple times.
Yeah.
And Diane herself, she just had this minor, what turned out to be a self-inflicted wound to her forearm.
So the sources document that the moment she arrived at the emergency room, the red flags just shot up
immediately. For the staff who are, desperately working to save her children, Diane's behavior was just profoundly disconnected from the trauma unfolding.
She was strangely composed, you said, almost performative.
Yes, performative in her brief moments of distress. But her true focus, her real priority, was on her own life. Her primary, persistent concern was tracking down her married lover, Robert Knickerbocker,
who she was obsessively pursuing.
This is where we really start to see the psychological profile emerge. What's fascinating about the sociopathic profile is that unsettling inconsistency in their emotional output.
Right. The sources describe her swinging wildly.
Exactly. Sobbing dramatically one moment, when she felt she was being watched.
Only to be cracking jokes or talking about her romantic troubles seconds later.
Seemingly oblivious to the fact that one of her children was dead in the next room and 2 more were fighting for their lives.
Yeah.
It was like she was delivering the performance she thought a grieving mother should give.
But it lacked any genuine emotional depth. There was no urgency for her children's well-being.
None at all. And the core of the prosecution's case eventually rested on that motive. Diane wanted to remove the obstacle for children so she could pursue Knickerbocker.
Because he had allegedly told her he did not want children in his life.
Right. But the turning point in the investigation, the thing that really broke the case open, was her oldest surviving daughter, Christy.
An absolutely vital. Christy Downs was left paralyzed by the shooting, and she'd suffered.
Which temporarily rendered her unable to speak. But the moment she could communicate again, she became the key witness.
And she was able to use, anatomically correct dolls and hand signals to identify her mother as the shooter.
Yes, and this testimony was a massive step for child victim advocacy. It dramatically changed how child witnesses were handled in the courtroom. It allowed children to safely convey abuse or trauma without being forced into that direct, intimidating cross-examination right away.
And Christy's testimony was unequivocal. The bushy-haired stranger was a lie. It was her mother who had fired the shots.
And Diane's arrogance, even during the trial, was just breathtaking. She maintained that dramatic, indignant insistence of her.
Often smiling at the jury, right? Claiming, "I have not murdered my children. even in the face of her own daughter's devastating testimony.
The sources detail how she became this media spectacle, dyeing her hair, trying to play the innocent victim, right up until the very end.
And that profound sense of entitlement and control didn't just stop with her conviction. She remained fundamentally defiant.
She did. In 1987, she executed this highly publicized escape from the Oregon Women's Correctional Center, scaled a fence during an exercise period.
And she was at large for a staggering 10 days before they recaptured her.
That act, that attempt to reclaim her freedom, it just completely validated the prosecution's original motive theory.
And she is still incarcerated today. She's routinely denied parole every few years, and she always sticks to her original baseless lie.
But the ultimate narrative contrast here, the real closure for the public, is the fate of the two children she failed to kill.
Christy and Danny Downs were adopted by the prosecutor in the case. Fred, he and his wife provided them with the stability and safety their biological mother had so violently stripped away.
It's an extraordinary act of redemption by the justice system itself, a critical detail because it shows that while the trauma is, of course, permanent, the system, when it's operating correctly, can sometimes salvage the life that the crime tried to erase.
Okay, so moving from that explosive, immediate violence, let's pivot to a different type of calculation. This one involving cold domestic poisoning. We're talking about the case of Diane Stout.
The methodology is completely different, but that core motive, the desire for freedom and the elimination of life's burdens, it remains chillingly familiar.
Diane Stout in Springfield, Missouri, she presented this perfect, respectable facade.
Absolutely. A mother, a seemingly devoted wife, and a very talented church organist who was active in her community. This public image of devotion is what enabled her deception. It made her crime much harder to detect initially.
Because she lacked those visible red flags of erratic behavior that we saw with someone like Diane.
Exactly. But the sources reveal this deep, simmering resentment hidden right beneath that mask. Her husband, Mark, she viewed him as lazy.
And her autistic son, Shaw, she publicly described him as worse than a pest, or just another burden.
She saw them purely as anchors, things preventing her from living the life she desired. The weapon she chose was silent, insidious. She mixed ethylene glycol antifreeze into their favorite drink,
specifically Gatorade and Coca-Cola.
And this is a crucial detail for understanding these kinds of poisoning cases. Antifreeze, when you give it in small, repeated doses, can mimic the symptoms of various debilitating illnesses.
Like kidney failure or an extreme flu. It makes the deaths appear natural or due to some medical crisis.
And that's what happened. Both Mark and Shaw died following weeks of this unexplained sickness. The pattern only became clear when her daughter Sarah fell violently ill in June of 2013.
She suffered severe kidney and organ failure.
Right. But the truly shocking trigger for the arrest wasn't just the lab analysis, which did eventually confirm the poisoning. It was the human element.
A concerned pastor at Diane's church troubled by her joke.
Her disturbingly casual and inappropriate jokes about her husband's and son's deaths. He contacted the police and urged them to look close. The indifference she displayed toward the tragedy she was orchestrating was ultimately her downfall.
Her confession, when it came, was chilling in its casualness.
It was. She admitted everything, stating simply that she hated Mark and felt Shaw was a burden she needed to eliminate to gain her freedom.
Which just confirms this was not a crime of passion or some kind of psychotic break. Whole deliberate calculation for person.
And we also have to acknowledge the complexities surrounding the surviving family. Her other daughter, Rachel, she cooperated with the prosecution.
She pled guilty and testified against her mother, and she received a reduced sentence of 2 life terms with the possibility of parole.
While Sarah miraculously survived the attempt on her life.
The intimacy of domestic poisoning, where the object of comfort, a favorite drink, is weaponized, it just shows the depth of betrayal when calculation replaces care.
And that theme of pursuing freedom at any cost brings us directly to perhaps the most controversial modern case in your stack, Casey Anthony and the disappearance of 2-year-old Kaylee.
This concept of selfish freedom was the entire foundation of the prosecution's theory in the Anthony trial.
It was. And if you just look at the facts of the 31 days following Kaylee's disappearance in June 2008, they are deeply unsettling, and they absolutely formed the public's perception of her guilt.
While her daughter was missing, Casey was documented partying, drinking, entering hot body contests,
and getting a new tattoo reading Bella Vita, The Good Life.
That period of indifference is just so central to the narrative of betrayal, and the whole situation only exploded into public view on July 15th, 2008.
When her mother, Cindy Anthony, located the abandoned car and was just overwhelmed by what she called the horrifying, unmistakable smell of human decomposition when she opened the trunk.
That infamous 911 call, that was the moment Casey's constructed reality of lies just instantly collapsed.
The physical evidence they collected from that trunk, and later, from the woods where Kaylee's remains were found in December 2008, it was compelling. But ultimately, it was insufficient to meet the legal standard for murder.
What did they find exactly?
Forensic testing found strong evidence of human decomposition in the trunk, a single strand of deceased hair, and high levels of chloroform.
Which is a common solvent, but it's also an anesthetic. It's capable of rendering a person unconscious.
Right. And when Kaylee's remains were recovered, duct tape was found near her skull, which suggested suffocation.
But this is where we have to address the legal distinction that derailed the process. The 2011 verdict stunned the nation. Casey Anthony was found not guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter, and aggravated child.
She was convicted only of 4 counts of lying to law enforcement.
So what was the problem for the state?
The difficulty for the state lay in proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense, which was led by Jose Baez, they countered the prosecution's premeditation theory with this shocking, though completely unproven, alternative narrative.
That Kaylee accidentally drowned in the family pool, and that George Anthony's father covered up the death.
And they threw in this allegation that Casey had been sexually abused by her father, which they claimed conditioned her to lie reflexively about everything.
So the defense succeeded not by proving Casey was innocent, but by proving the state couldn't definitively prove how Kaylee died.
Or that Casey possessed the premeditation necessary for a murder conviction. The burden of proof for homicide is extremely high, and the defense used those unproven theories and Casey's 31 days of lying to establish enough reasonable doubt.
Enough doubt that a conviction on murder charges just couldn't stand.
And the public outcry was explosive, precisely because, while that legal standard wasn't met, the ethical and moral betrayal was just overwhelming.
The Anthony case really illustrates a uniquely modern problem, doesn't it? The sheer volume of 247 media coverage and social judgment creates a verdict long before the jury ever speaks.
It really does.
Okay, so let's put that calculated silent malice into a broader historical perspective. We're going to shift back 125 years to Victorian England and the cold calm of Mary Ann Britland.
Mary Ann Britland offers a chilling historical parallel to Diane Stout. It really confirms that the motive of eliminating inconvenience via poisoning operates across all centuries and all social classes.
She was outwardly quiet, moving through her community in Ashton-under-Lyne Mansion, 1886.
And the sources outline this precise pattern of sudden related deaths in her immediate vicinity. First, her daughter Elizabeth.
Then her husband Thomas, and finally her neighbor, Mary Dick.
And the community watched, but Mary Ann moved through these tragedies untouched, unnoticed, and unquestioned for a crucial period of time.
What's remarkable is that the investigation that followed relied so heavily on meticulous archival documentation, not modern forensic science.
Exactly. They didn't have DNA, but they had ledger books. Specifically, her signatures in the local chemist poison registers became the smoking gun.
The sources detail her purchases of arsenic-based vermin killer and strychnine, and she's stating the purpose on the register was always for rats.
The timing was critical and methodical. Her first purchase preceded her daughter's death. Her second purchase aligned almost perfectly with her husband's fatal collapse.
And she even made final inquiries about poison shortly before her neighbor Mary Dixon suddenly declined.
So the evidence wasn't some flash-in-the-pan circumstantial material. It was a precise, documented sequence linking chemical purchase records, her signature, and 3 related deaths.
This historical context, it really emphasizes the contrast between eras.
It does. Britland operated in quiet anonymity, relying on society's general acceptance of sudden illness. The evidence that convicted her was literally documented in a public ledger.
And you compare that to the overwhelming, confusing media frenzy surrounding Casey Anthony, which just complicates the interpretive evidence.
In both cases, however, the root cause was the same: that cold, deliberate calculation to eliminate human inconvenience.
That brings Section 1 to a powerful close. We've covered cold, calculated malice, the sociopathic betrayal driven by selfishness and the desire for freedom. Now we have to turn a corner. We're moving into the profoundly disturbing territory of mental fracture, delusion, and the spectacular failures of societal systems to protect the vulnerable.
We are now shifting our focus entirely. We're moving away from a mind that is aware of its actions and manipulating the system for personal gain toward a mind that is completely fractured.
Where the internal delusional reality is what dictates these fatal actions.
Exactly. And no case better illustrates this necessary distinction than the tragedy of Andrea Yates.
Let's really unpack this one, because the Yates case fundamentally altered how the legal system and the public approach severe postpartum mental.
On the surface, the Yates family in Houston seemed like a picture of American middle-class stability. A former nurse, 5 beautiful children, a husband working at NASA.
But Andrea was fighting a long, well-documented war against severe postpartum depression and psychosis. She had multiple hospitalizations and 2 documented suicide attempts.
And the crucial medical detail that the sources really stress is the clear, documented warnings given to Andrea Andrea and her husband, Rusty. Doctors explicitly warned them that having a fifth child could trigger a catastrophic relapse.
A relapse that could push her past the point of recovery.
Yes, and despite these clear medical boundaries, they had baby Mary, and Andrea's mental health just spiraled downward into a world defined by severe religious delusion.
The nature of her psychosis is horrifying. She became consumed by religious obsession, specifically focused on her perceived moral failings.
She was utterly convinced she was a wicked, irredeemable mother, and that her failure meant her children were destined for eternal torment in hell.
So in her profoundly fractured state, she believed the only act of true love she had left save her children by sending them immediately to heaven.
And on the morning of June 20th, 2001, she carried out that methodical, terrifying act, drowning all 5 children one by one in the bathtub.
She even chased her oldest son, Noah, who walked in on the scene and tried to escape.
She called the police immediately afterward, then called her husband and just waited calmly for them to arrive. This complete absence of concealment or flight is often a telltale sign.
A sign that the perpetrator isn't operating under rational, calculated intent.
But under the absolute control of a delusion, she wasn't seeking freedom. She was following a twisted internal mandate.
The legal battle that followed was just intense. Was she a cold-blooded killer operating under religious mania, or was she a gravely ill woman ravaged by a recognized medical?
Her initial 2002 conviction for capital murder was eventually overturned in 2005, and the reason was false testimony.
That is the core legal insight here, isn't it? The prosecution's key forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Park Dietz, provided false testimony.
He did. He claimed that Andrea Yates had gotten the idea to plead insanity from a non-existent episode of the TV show Law & Order.
Which was later proven to be completely false. No such episode ever existed.
But it was enough to introduce prejudice into the initial trial, and that led to the appeal and the overturning of the conviction.
That revelation was enough to secure a retrial in 2006.
This time, the defense presented a much clearer, more comprehensive view of her documented psychosis. They emphasized the severity of her mental state at the time of the killings.
And the jury agreed, finding her not guilty by reason of insanity.
And just to clarify for the listener, not guilty by reason of insanity is not an acquittal that results in freedom. It means the person who committed the act, but they lacked the capacity to know right from wrong at the time due to a mental disease.
And so they're committed to a secure state mental hospital for treatment and confinement.
Correct. The sources paint a very poignant picture of her life now at Kerrville State. Quiet, structured, and consistently waives her right every year to be reviewed for potential.
She recognizes the danger her illness poses.
She does. She spends her time creating artwork and watching home videos of the children she killed. This is not the profile of a narcissist enjoying freedom. This is a person consumed and destroyed by the devastating illness that stole her mind, her children, and her life.
The Yates case remains the benchmark for understanding the intersection of perinatal mental health and the legal definition of insanity. Now let's pivot to a case that is often mistakenly grouped with psychosis, but is fundamentally a calculated, lifelong fabrication of reality.
The caretaker as torment. We're talking about the case of Dee and Gypsy Rose Blanchard.
And this moves us firmly into the territory of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or MSP.
Now more commonly called factitious disorder imposed on another. This is a crucial technical distinction. Unlike psychosis, where the mind genuinely believes the delusion.
The core of MSP is calculated, deliberate deception.
Exactly. The caregiver, D in this case, is fabricating or actively inducing medical symptoms in the victim, Gypsy Rose, not because she's insane, but to satisfy the mother's warped pathological need for attention, sympathy, financial gain, and absolute control.
To the outside world, Dee and Gypsy Rose were the ultimate inspirational figures.
The tireless single mother and her sweet, multi-afflicted daughter, who supposedly suffered from leukemia, muscular dystrophy, epilepsy,
and relied on a feeding tube and a wheelchair.
And this narrative of victimhood brought them constant community adoration, media attention, and substantial financial support. Donations, trip, a subsidized home.
But it was all a devastating, comprehensive lie spanning nearly 2 decades. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was perfectly healthy.
Dee constructed an entire world of illness around her daughter, forcing her into a wheelchair, shaping her head to mimic chemotherapy, insisting on unnecessary medication.
And convincing doctors through this brilliant manipulative performance to perform surgeries, including the insertion of a feeding tube.
Gypsy spent her entire childhood imprisoned in a medical crisis that did not exist, leading to deep physical and psychological trauma.
The breaking point is one of the most unbelievable details in the source material. Gypsy, upon gaining secret internet access, realized the horrifying truth.
That she was healthy and her mother was a captor. She saw escape by meeting Nicholas Godejohn online, and together They conspired to kill Dee.
The chilling, almost defiant final communication was that Facebook post made from Gypsy's profile shortly after the murder, that B dead.
So the legal response had to grapple with this unprecedented medical abuse. Nicholas Kodojan, the actual perpetrator of the stabbing, he received life imprisonment.
But Gypsy's role was viewed through the lens of victimhood.
It was. Prosecutors acknowledged that she was a victim of lifelong medical abuse, profound isolation, and psychological manipulation that distorted her perception of reality and escape.
So she accepted a plea deal for second-degree murder, receiving a 10-year sentence, much lighter than her accomplice.
The betrayal here is an extraordinary example of calculated, slow-motion destruction of identity, all hidden meticulously behind a loving maternal facade. The MSP profile is one of profound calculation, not fracture.
But sometimes it's not the acute individual delusion or calculation, but the wholesale systemic indifference that enables these horrors. We need to look at historical failures in child protection, specifically the cases of Aurora Gagnon and Alice.
These historical instances are crucial for the listener because they show what happens when cruelty is met with bureaucratic indifference. They reveal systems designed to look the other way, especially when the victim is poor, orphaned, or seen as disposable labor.
Take Aurora Gagnon in Quebec, Canada, in the early 20th century. The sources chronologically document the prolonged physical, the burns, the bruises, the sustained physical trauma inflicted by her stepmother.
And the horror wasn't just the abuse, it was the sheer number of people who knew.
Exactly. Multiple individuals, including local villagers and critically ill doctors, saw Aurora's injury.
They treated her wounds, but time and again they deferred responsibility. They cited the family unit as sacrosanct and returned the 10-year-old to the very household that was torturing her.
It demonstrates a horrifying systemic failure where responsibility was constantly outsourced or avoided until her death in 1920 from sustained trauma.
And her case was so instrumental that it led directly to the formation of Quebec's first child welfare agency.
And in the United States, we look at the tragedy of Alice Meeker from 1809 in Vermont. The family dynamic there was defined by poverty stress.
The husband, Allman, suffered physical impairments, including hearing damage and illness from his Civil War service. The key investigative detail that emerged, stark difference in treatment.
The abuse, the harsh, persistent punishment using household objects, severe food deprivation, was reserved specifically for the two orphaned children, Alice.
Right, who had been taken in. It contrasted sharply with how the Meekers treated their own biological children. The system saw orphans as cheap labor, minimizing oversight and allowing this targeted cruelty to flourish unseen.
So when Alice vanished, the mother, Alice Meeker, initially claimed the girl had just been sent away.
But under mounting pressure, the husband, Allman Meeker, he broke down and confessed. His confession led investigators to the recovery of Alice's remains from a shallow grave by the stream.
Which confirms the horrifying truth. When societal systems fail to provide oversight, or worse, when they institutionalize the exploitation of vulnerable children, betrayal and violence thrive in the darkness of the home.
And if we look for the most cynical, calculated, and long-term abuse purely for financial gain, we have to turn to the shocking Australian case of John and Sarah Macon, the baby farmers in Sydney.
This was not an act of passion or psychosis. This was a deliberate, long-term business model built entirely on financial exploitation.
And the desperate vulnerability of unmarried mothers seeking discretion in Victorian society, where having an illegitimate child meant immediate social ruin.
Their method was cruelly simple and effective. They placed newspaper advertisements offering infant adoption or care for a single lump sum payment.
And crucially, this guaranteed discretion and eliminated the need for mothers to pay ongoing weekly fee. Once that payment was made, the financial incentive for the Macons to keep the child alive disappeared completely.
The full horror was revealed in 1892. Following an investigation into their former residence in McDonaldtown, the police recovered the shocking remains of 12 infants buried beneath the property.
The scale of the murder for profit was overwhelming. The investigation relied heavily on parent testimony. Mothers came forward, describing paying the lump sum fee, being given vague excuses when they inquired later,
and inevitably never seeing their children again.
The identification of the remains was painstaking. It relied on clothing, specific physical characteristics, and the direct testimony of the paying mother, linking the Macons directly to the calculated deaths of children they had taken purely for financial exploitation.
And the Macons were ultimately convicted and became one of the first couples executed in New South. This was betrayal elevated to a mass financial industry.
We have navigated a difficult spectrum, from calculated narcissistic malice to devastating psychosis. psychosis, and deep systemic failures that enable abuse for profit. We have one final section focusing on the dark edges of juvenile crime, sensationalized media, and most critically, cases where investigative failures permanently limit the reach of justice.
We open this segment with two cases that force us to confront the question of juvenile darkness and society's capacity for rehabilitation in the 19th century. Jesse Pomeroy and Otto.
When a child commits an act of extreme, calculated violence, the system faces this enormous dilemma. Is this a criminal mind that must be punished, or is it a damaged mind that can be redeemed?
Jesse Pomeroy, active in Boston in the 1870s, showed clear escalating warning signs from a very young age. Isolation, severe animal cruelty,
and a noticeable scar over his eye that made him a target for bullying.
He was first arrested at age 12 for torturing neighborhood boys, often luring them away under false pretenses before brutally beating them.
He was committed to the state reform school at Westboro. He was later discharged as compliant in 1874 based on the belief that sustained good behavior meant reintegration into society was safe.
But the sources note a swift and brutal relapse, highlighting the profound institutional blindness of the era.
Shortly after his release, he committed the murder and mutilation of 10-year-old Katie Curran and 6-year-old Horace Milan. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that the system had seen the warning signs, chosen rehabilitation based on surface compliance, and failed to recognize the underlying violent pathology that immediately returned.
Now you contrast that swift relapse and the institutional failure with the case of Otto Luth in Cleveland, 1989.
Otto, only 14 or 15 years old, murdered 7-year-old Maggie Thompson. While he confessed, he later retracted the statement.
But he was found guilty of first-degree murder based largely on circumstantial evidence and that highly questionable confession from a minor.
And the resulting punishment is the key takeaway here. Otto Luth was executed by hanging in 1890. This serves as a stark reminder for you, the listener, of the unforgiving, non-rehabilitative nature of the justice system of that era for juvenile.
The system preferred swift certainty and finality, even when the evidence rested heavily on a confession from a minor under duress.
It reflected a profound societal rejection of juvenile culpability that is vastly different.
Okay, moving from the extreme finality of 19th century justice to the endless uncertainty of the modern era, we have to turn to the highly publicized and perpetually unsolved case of JonBenet Ramsey and the contaminated crime.
This modern case, from Christmas 1996, is a textbook example of procedural failure that permanently undermined the possibility of a definitive, satisfying legal resolution.
The first piece of evidence was the highly unusual ransom note found.
It spanned multiple pages, demanded a specific round sum, $118,000. Critically, was written on paper and with a pen found inside the ramp. It promised a call from the kidnappers that never came.
And the initial police response was catastrophically compromised.
Believing they were dealing with a kidnapping scenario because of the note, the police focused entirely on waiting for the promised call. This meant the house was not secured as a crime.
Family friends were allowed to enter, move through the house, and drink coffee, inadvertently destroying or moving critical trace evidence.
That assumption was tragically shattered at 1 p.m. when John Ramsey was asked by police to conduct a thorough search. He went to the basement storage room and found his daughter's body.
She was bound with a cord around her neck.
And the scene was further compromised when he immediately carried her body upstairs into the main living area, potentially transferring or losing crucial forensic data at the primary crime.
The enduring controversy centers so heavily on the unidentified male DNA found on JonBenet's clothes.
It does. And while this DNA is inconsistent with any member of the immediate family, the forensic insight here is vital. Experts caution that this is a mixed sample,
meaning it could contain genetic material from multiple people. And its origin, and crucially, the timing of its deposit cannot be definitive.
This could be DNA from the actual killer, or it could be touch DNA transferred from a factory worker who made the clothing months earlier, exacerbated by the compromised crime scene.
So in 1999, a grand jury approved indictments for child abuse, resulting in deaths.
But the district attorney, Alex Hunter, he declined to prosecute. He deemed the evidence, particularly given the contamination and the DNA uncertainties, legally insufficient for conviction.
And the case remains officially unsolved, perpetually frozen in a state of suspicion and uncertainty due to those initial catastrophic procedural errors.
Uncertainty is also the defining characteristic of our next case, the iconic, tragic cold case of the Black Dahlia, Elizabeth Short, in 1947, Los Angeles.
The Black Dahlia case is seminal not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because it marked the birth of modern media. It really established the standard for true crime coverage.
The last confirmed sighting was January 9, 1947, when a salesman named Robert Red Manley dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel lobby.
The discovery days later was grotesque and meticulously staged. Her body was found bisected at the waist, completely exsanguinated, drained of blood, and washed clean.
And disturbingly, the mutilation included slicing the corners of her mouth into a Glasgow smile, and her intestines had been carefully tucked beneath the lower half, reinforcing the controlled, calculated nature of the perpetrator.
The press frenzy was immediate, overwhelming, and ethically corrupt.
The Los Angeles Examiner contacted Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe Short, in Massachusetts, and actually lied to her. They claimed Elizabeth had won a beauty contest just to extract biographical details and photos.
Only once they had secured their sensational narrative did they inform her that she had been brutally murdered.
That tactic cemented the ethical failures of modern journalism and immediately turned the victim into a sensationalized myth, which was then cemented by the nickname Black Dahlia.
And the investigation was immediately plagued by information overload and a profound lack of consistent procedure.
The press published specific details of the crime scene, which led to over 500 false confessions flooding the police department, completely overwhelming legitimate leads.
Key suspects, like Robert Redman, were questioned repeatedly and passed multiple polygraph tests.
And while figures like Dr. George Hodel emerged years later as strong suspects based on familial testimony and circumstantial evidence, the case was so compromised and the evidence so deteriorated that no charges were ever filed.
So the Black Dahlia case tragically demonstrates how media sensationalism can permanently eclipse the facts and overwhelm the investigative process, ensuring no satisfactory conclusion.
And it represents a failure to achieve justice due to that sensationalism and information.
Let's end this section with a fascinating case that was actually successfully solved through unique forensic means in the late 1930s, a Cuban crime of identity. Celia Margarita Mena in Havana.
This case is vital because it showcases the early global adoption of scientific systematic investigation. Celia Mena disappeared while living with Rene Hidalgo Ramos, who was identified in reports as a policeman or former policeman.
Which is an element of insider knowledge that often complicates these cases.
It does. The investigation began with a grim discovery. A sewer worker found a severed human leg wrapped in a jute sack. Additional fragmented body parts were found separately across Havana.
And the investigation initially stalled because they were missing the critical component for identification, the head. Without the head, visual identification was impossible. They just had fragmented remains.
The critical breakthrough came months later when authorities were alerted to a discovery inside a latrine in Sergio de Parabano. They recovered the head.
And identification was quickly and definitively made through specific physical characteristics, most notably her complex and unique dental work.
This use of forensic odontology, or dental records, to restore identity from fragmented remains was a key, sophisticated forensic step in early Cuban investigation. It helped reassemble the victim's identity and the crime.
So Hidalgo Ramos was eventually interrogated. He confessed to the death, but he claimed it was accidental during an argument, followed by a frantic concealment and fragmentation.
He was subjected to the first documented use of a lie detector in a Cuban criminal case, although the results, as is common with early polygraphs, were inconclusive. He was convicted and sentenced to 28 years.
So this case, though grim, it provides a clear, successful example of how painstaking early forensic science can reassemble fragmented evidence into identity and ultimately lead to judicial truth.
That was truly a deep dive into the darkest reaches of your source material. We moved from the calculated, cold-blooded malice of women like Diane Downs and Diane Stout, who killed for the selfish goal of personal freedom,
to the shattering, tragic impact of severe mental illness, as we saw in the profound tragedy of Andrea Yates. We also explored the calculated, decades-long erosion of identity masked as care in the Dee and Gypsy Rose Blanchard case.
And the historical indifference that condemned children like Aurore Gagnon and enabled the horrifying exploitation of the baby farmers.
And we ended by analyzing the limits of justice itself. We saw how the system's certainty and harsh finality in the 19th century, as with Otto Luth, contrasted sharply with the endless uncertainty resulting from modern, like the JonBenet Ramsey.
And we noted the profound destructive power of media sensationalism, which turned the brutal death of Elizabeth Short into the mythological cold case of the Black Dahlia.
So what does this all synthesize?
Well, if we connect this back to the bigger picture, the evidence shows that these acts of ultimate betrayal often fall along a complex moral and psychological spectrum. In many of these cases, especially the complex ones like Yates versus Anthony, the legal system ultimately had to make the hardest distinction.
Was the act driven by a rational, calculated evil intent that understood the wrongfulness of the...
Or was it driven by a complete, genuine detachment from reality due to a recognized mental disease psychosis? That decision, whether a person faces a prison sentence or compulsory psychiatric care, remains the most profound, difficult question in criminal justice. It determines not just punishment but culpability.
Absolutely. And that leads to our final provocative thought for you. In the cases that remain officially unresolved, like John Benet Ramsey or the Black Dahlia, the system fails to provide a definitive legal. This absence of a clear verdict forces the public, you included, to fill the void. What is the inherent human need to achieve closure, and what is the danger when we satisfying narrative, often fueled by media sensationalism and assumption, for proven, established, but perhaps inconclusive evidence? We leave you with that thought.